The Honourable Member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise tonight to address a question that I had months ago about the new NAFTA to the Prime Minister about whether or not we would see debate inside of this House, to have transparency and to be open about what it was that Canadians were signing on to through the Liberals in the renegotiation of the new NAFTA. And, you know, what we know now, Mr. Speaker, is there's great uncertainty that surrounds the ratification. Of course, New Democrats were pleased to see Democrats in the U.S. have success in the new Congress. And I myself have visited Washington, and I can tell you that there's a significant change in the tone and conversations that are taking place around the new NAFTA. And it's quite clear at this time as well that Democrats in the U.S. are looking to reopen the deal, to renegotiate some of the portions around the environment, around labor, and around the high cost of pharmaceuticals and the drug patent extension that happened in the New Deal. It will come as no surprise that New Democrats will welcome the work of Democrats in the United States in an effort to improve the deal, in an effort to see some progressive elements actually come to fruition in this deal, because unfortunately what we've signed on to in the new USMCA is a concessionary deal, Mr. Speaker. So we're hopeful that those efforts will be successful, and of course that the Liberal government here in Canada will be open to improving labor standards, to improving environmental standards, and of course to seeing the cost of drugs being reduced for Canadians and certainly for all people across all three countries who will be impacted by this deal. So the future right now, Mr. Speaker, of the deal is quite uncertain, but I believe that there's a positive path forward, that we'll see improvements made to this deal that I am hopeful that the Liberal government will have wide open arms to on behalf of Canadians, because it's an opportunity not just for us to improve the deal on those three areas that I mentioned, but also to address the still lingering and very, very harmful steel and aluminum tariffs, which we now know in some way Russia has been able to have aluminum tariffs removed and Canada is unable to. So we need to have every opportunity to improve our trading relationship with the United States that we can take at this moment in time. And again, I hope that we will welcome these additions and we will look for improvements in the lives of Canadians. And at the heart of the new NAFTA, of course, are millions of people who work every day for a decent life for their families and communities. 23 years ago, when NAFTA was being originally negotiated by Mulroney Conservatives, they tried desperately to sell Canadian workers on the idea that it was more than just a trade deal. They tried to make the case that the trilateral deal would bring prosperity to everyone across the continent. They claimed it was going to be an equalizer for all. Working people studied NAFTA carefully and began to raise the alarm bells that it would not work. Labor and civil society brought their concerns to the streets over the weak side agreements that they rightly claimed would do nothing to change the inequalities. And of course, Mr. Speaker, we've seen this play out across our country as well. Conservatives pressed on in the original NAFTA, and now in 2018, we can see the impact that this idea that was promoted by them has had on working class people. Successive governments have neglected to address the alarming reality that the NAFTA promise of 1988 has not led to increased standards of living for all. The only benefit has been for those who already held the power and the influence. Income and wealth inequality in Canada today is at a crisis level. And as my colleague rightly pointed out from Burnaby, New Westminster today, 46% of Canadians are $200 away from financial trouble. And working people who will be impacted by the new NAFTA, working people like those in Oshawa, Mr. Speaker, who are fighting for their jobs, despite the fact that Liberals are saying everything has been solved in this new trade agreement, that again is not reaching working people. So today I really rise, and my question to the Liberals today, that if trade deals like the new NAFTA are so good for working people, why are the auto workers in Oshawa out fighting for their lives right now with no Liberal representation in sight. I would note that, Mr. Speaker, and all of those workers have noted that as well. If these deals are so good for working people, then why, after signing this deal, does the harm continue to impact working people who are losing their jobs while Mexico is growing?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Throughout negotiations, our government has been committed to transparency, inclusiveness, and openness. We engaged and consulted with a variety of stakeholders from all economic sectors, with labour organizations, women, youth, Indigenous peoples, civil society organizations, and academics. We also worked very closely with our provincial and territorial colleagues and delivered a whole-of-Canada approach to advancing Canadian interests across the table. Mr. Speaker, there has been a lot of praise given to this government for negotiating this deal, and it's thanks to many stakeholders and industries across this country, including the Canadian Labour Congress and Unifor. As the Prime Minister said, we are very grateful.
An awful lot of feedback. I wonder if she might want to just check the earpieces. Volume might be turned up just on the desk next to her, possibly. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, okay. Let's give that a try. Okay. Sorry I don't like to interrupt the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, but just in the interest of getting the sound right. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you. As the Prime Minister said, we're very grateful. Is that better, Mr. Speaker? To Canadian stakeholders that took part in these consultations. Views provided were very helpful in informing Canada's position at the negotiating table and in finding creative solutions to address the unconventional proposals at the table. Jerry Diaz and Hassan Youssef have worked closely with us every step of the way to ensure that this deal would be the best possible one for workers, for labour, and for Canadians. And with this close cooperation with stakeholders and labour is why this deal is great for Canadian workers. The member opposite will be happy to know that the enforceable provisions in the new NAFTA that protect labour are the strongest in any Canadian trade agreement to date. The new auto rules of origin will directly secure the future for auto workers in cities such as Windsor and Oshawa. As Jerry Diaz of Unifor has said, quote, "This is a much better deal than the deal that was signed 24 years ago," unquote. The new agreement also reinforces the strong economic ties between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, while recognizing the importance of inclusive trade by including key outcomes in areas such as labour, environment, as well as on gender and Indigenous peoples. It preserves Canada's preferential access to the U.S. market while updating and modernizing the old NAFTA agreement in areas such as digital trade, telecommunications, and anti-corruption. Importantly, it means Canadian workers and their families will enjoy greater opportunities than ever before. The member opposite will also be happy to know that with the new agreement, we've sought the strongest labour chapter of any trade agreement that Canada is party to. The agreement's labour chapter aims to level the playing field on labour standards and working conditions in North America and contains commitments to ensure national laws and policies provide protection for fundamental principles and rights at work. The new agreement also contains enforceable provisions that protect women's rights and minority rights, Indigenous rights, and environmental protections that are the strongest in any Canadian trade agreement to date. For the first time in a Canadian trade agreement, the outcome incorporates a general exception that clearly confirms that the government can adopt or maintain measures it deems necessary to fulfill its legal obligations to Indigenous peoples. As Perry Bellegarde said, the provisions addressing Indigenous peoples in the deal make it the most inclusive international trade agreement for Indigenous peoples to date. Through the ratification process, we look forward to bringing the agreement to Parliament. This includes the Standing Committee on International Trade, which was my honour to serve on for 2 years, and with the member opposite, and I look forward to the future for this agreement. Thank you.
Member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to take my opportunity for a reply to say that I'm sure that while the Liberals love to invoke Jerry Dias, the president of Unifor, my former president, I can tell you that right now, this Liberal government has abandoned auto workers in Oshawa. They are not helping them on their jobs. They are not helping them to keep their jobs. So while they like to stand in this House and invoke Labour and act as though they are the party that is standing with Labour in the negotiation of this deal, I can tell you clearly that Unifor members are contacting me every day, that Jerry Dias and I are speaking, that Colin James, who's the president of Unifor Local 222 in Oshawa, where one of your members sits, where Jen Cowie, who's an incredible activist who's out there every single day. Once again, governments of Canada, the Liberals and Conservatives alike, but the Liberals today have left working people to fend for themselves. And there are no workers who are out there in the cold today in GM, at GM, fighting for their jobs in Oshawa, who believe that the Liberal government will ever stand with them. This trade agreement has done nothing to prevent the loss of jobs, and the Liberals have shown that they will not stand with working people when push comes to shove. So the New Democrats will continue to stand with working people, with auto workers in our country, and no one is fooled by the Liberal government.
Parliamentary Secretary.
I'm very happy to stand in this House and state that the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement preserves key elements of